This is our first live event presentation since COVID, and it's great to see a big turnout. It's really good to be getting back together in person again. Hopefully the sound is good. Everybody can hear all the way in the back and the front. Sound good? Awesome. So I'm looking forward to a great topic. Obviously, with the turnout, there's a lot of people interested in this subject, so I think it'll be a great experience. A few housekeeping items. Most of you know SAE is a volunteer-run organization. Our local chapter is always looking for help. If you're interested in these kinds of events and want to help organize them, if you've got some ideas of places that'd be a good tour or presentation, let us know, or join the board and organize them yourself. Help us out. We really appreciate any help we can get. We've got a few events coming up. On March 9th, we have a webinar about the 1,000 horsepower Scorpion EV. We've got a board meeting coming up on the 16th, so if you're interested in getting involved, you can always join a board meeting and see what we do and see where you might fit in. March 25th, we have our big student showcase career fair at the SEMA Garage. This was the biggest event we've ever had with over 275 attendees last year. It's a big student workshop for the SAE student projects. Really interesting. It's a great recruiting opportunity for companies that are looking to hire graduates with automotive interest and experience. As you most of you probably know, we got the Acura Grand Prix of Long Beach coming up April 14th through 16th. We have a couple of events going on with that. You can find out on our website. And then May 6th, our friends at Vitalink are hosting their annual Energy Invitational competition. It's a high school student competition, and they need volunteers to help with the event. So if you're interested in helping out with education and seeing what the student projects are, it's a really interesting opportunity to get to see something that's always a unique experience. We didn't have to charge for this meeting tonight. We're able to host it. Thank you to Honda and to our members. Keep your memberships up to date. That's where most of our funds come in. So if you're not a member, renew your membership, join, and get involved. And when you join, make sure you opt in on email. SAE is very strict about emailing people that don't opt in, so we can't get the word out to events if you don't opt in. I want to thank in advance David and David for coming out here to give the presentation for us. I'm really excited to hear it. And with that, Carl Pulley is our host here at Honda. He's going to tell us a little bit more about this collection and its future. Carl? And thank you for hosting us.
You're welcome. Good evening, everyone. It's great to see so many faces here. I thought this was supposed to be a group of engineers, but I don't see a pocket protector in sight, so I think you're all lying to me. So anyway, you can come and beat me up later. Thank you very much for joining us in our humble American Honda Collection Hall. So as you probably drove up, you're like, where am I going? This is this nondescript warehouse. It's supposed to be some sort of Honda museum here. This has been around for about 15 years, and Honda has always been a very progressive company, thinking about what we're going to do in the future. And we've had a very bright future. In fact, this is the 75th anniversary of Honda Motor Company. So in 1948, when Mr. Honda first designed an engine that can strap onto a bicycle to provide post-World War II transportation to Japanese people, we've moved always forward with what do we do next, what can we create that assists people. And fundamentally, perhaps more than most auto manufacturers and motorcycle manufacturers, we are first and foremost an engineering company. We have always been led, our president of Honda Motors has always been an engineer by training. And so kind of speaking to you people, that's kind of a fundamental thing that's that's really at the core of Honda. You know, from the first ever generator that we ever produced, there's an urban legend that Mr. Honda and Mr. Sony were playing golf one day, and Mr. Sony said, "Oh, Mr. Honda, I've come up with this portable television. It's going to be great. You'll have a screen, you got to watch TV." And so Mr. Honda said, "Well, how are you going to power it?" He said, "Well, that's your job, Mr. Honda." And so from that, we have an example of the first strap-on engine. And then when we kind of move into motorcycles, we have a Honda Cub, the best-selling automotive product ever, selling more than 100 million vehicles worldwide. And then in 1969, we basically blew the British motorcycle industry, and you can probably tell I'm from Britain, out of the water with the CB750. We've continued to push forward, designing new products from our engineers that help people's lives be better. We have first generation Civic. The CVCC was the only vehicle at the time that could meet emission standards without the use of a catalytic converter. The famous iVTEC system that allowed low-end torque as well as high rev horsepower. We have the Honda Jet, for goodness sake. The wonderful thing about Honda is that we give our engineers a lot of leeway to come up with cool new things. We just issued a press release yesterday. Our Honda Performance Development Wing just came up with an 800 horsepower CR-V that's powered by an IndyCar engine with a hybrid powertrain that's basically in development for the introduction of the 2024 IndyCar series that will use hybrid powertrains. So we do give our engineers, in fact, there's a worldwide competition for Honda engineers that they come up with and submit ideas about something cool, something just wildly crazy, and it goes through a review process, and the winner gets funded to actually build that thing. So it expands people's horizons, it gives them new opportunities, they try different things. We often rotate our engineers through all of our different product lines, from motorcycle to automobile to power equipment, and then Formula One, IndyCar. So they get a lot of experience. So I know that we have some students here. It's really easy to find out where jobs are available at Honda. Just go to honda.com, and you have a drop down, it says careers. So if you're interested in Honda Jet and all of their other product lines, then that's the place to have a look. So I just want to mention a little bit more about the future of this space. So I took this over during COVID, and it had been mothballed for years. In fact, most associates do not know that this place exists, let alone actually coming to this space. So we're changing that. We're in the process of reimagining our headquarters lobby just down the road. So we're knocking out walls, we're knocking out conference rooms, and we're going to move this collection into our lobby. But not only that, which means that everyone that walks through that lobby door will see the collection, albeit smaller, because the area isn't as large, but also we're going to reach out to the community. So my plan is that we're going to have bi-monthly cars, bikes, and coffee events where we have an open house so people can come into the lobby, they can see our collection, they can bring their own cool products, motorcycles, cars. I don't know if anyone's show up with a Honda lawnmower, but hey, we're all welcome. So, you know, I will let, through press releases, I'll let the public know, and I'll be reaching out to groups such as yours if you're interested in coming on one of those Saturdays. Would love to see you. So thanks again, enjoy the presentation, and thank you again for coming.
Hi there, my name's Dean Case, for those I haven't met. Thank you for coming. As Mike said, this is our first event since February of 2020. We have had a couple of student events, and over the last few years, that's really been kind of the focus of what SAE Southern California has been. We have 18 student groups in the section, including, I'm not sure if they made it here, anyone from Caltech here tonight yet? Yes. For the first time ever, we have a student chapter at Caltech. So if you're looking for, introduce yourself to them. We've got a strong turnout from Long Beach State. Where's the Long Beach team? And they were helping with registration and setup. Thank you, Long Beach. While companies have struggled with COVID, the schools were really hit hard. So we've got a lot of schools, even the ones like CSUN and Poly Pomona and Cal State LA, who have amazing legacies. they graduated a bunch of seniors without going to competition, and now we have a lot of first and second year students trying to take leadership roles, and no one really there to help them. And so that's the type of things we're looking for if you can get involved on the board. We're particularly looking for people who came from Formula or Baja experience to help mentor. And I'll have to say one of my frustrations with a certain few companies, I'll let go nameless, they heavily recruit at Formula SAE, then they don't even support their engineers being involved once they're working. And that seems a shame, because there's a huge opportunity. And how many of you out here is your company hiring? Raise your hand. Okay, for all the students, anybody else who's looking for a job, people who are hiring, put your hands back up. Look for them afterwards, because what we really stress is this is an amazing talent pool, not just for the students, but like I said, 18 student groups in the section. So if you're looking to hire, please come to the event March 25th. We'll have information coming out on that soon. We're asking companies to kick in $300 each if you'd like to recruit there. We don't try to make money. We're just trying to break even on these events. And ultimately, if you'd like to see us do more events, we need more people to step up and volunteer. And if you're wondering about the time commitment, think of it in two ways. You could either set up like one event like this, which I think I probably spent 15 hours setting up, along with other people. Mike Moyer helped, TJ Keon, and others. It takes a team to do these. And then you could be done for the year. Or if you'd like to be involved and help us on communications or with student groups, maybe an hour or 2 hours a month. It's got to be volunteer, it's got to be fun. But there's this is a great excuse to cold call anybody you want. This is a private collection that if you didn't have an in, you couldn't just walk in the door. Any recent graduates remember when we went to Vic Edelbrock's personal collection a few years back? No hands on that one. That was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And that collection doesn't exist and not open to the public anymore. Not open to anybody, even private groups. So that's the type of opportunities we can help you do. But just a couple little quick shout-outs. Anyone have a struggle hiring great technicians or fabricators? There's some hands there. You got to meet Lucas Pacheco. Where's Lucas? He runs a program at Hawthorne High School that is mind-bogglingly good. If you're looking for people who have a lot of talent to actually make parts, talk to Lucas. Another shout out, Robert Hess. Where's Robert? Any veterans in the room? Roberts runs a nonprofit for veterans in motorsports. It's a really cool program. So if you're looking for a nonprofit besides SA to get involved in, talk to Robert afterwards. And of course, thank you to Honda for allowing us to do this here. We're looking for other great places. So now I wanted to introduce our speaker. I met David Dewhurst about 20 years ago. I knew him as this great automotive photographer. And if you've ever read a car magazine or motorcycle magazine, you've seen his work. But I think I worked with him for several years. I was at Nissan, and he was shooting some of our press cars. And I'm sure he shot Honda and basically everybody. There was a short list of really great photographers, and David's in that list. And I don't think it was many years before I discovered, he's got this obsession with motocross. Very cool. And then when I heard about this book he was doing, I said, we need to have this in front of a larger audience here, because even if most of the people in the audience works in aerospace or four wheels, there's a lot of two-wheel enthusiasts within our ranks. And just by virtue, you look at the attendance at any Supercross in Southern California. So I knew this would be a strong draw. So you'll notice David speaks funny. He's from England, but we'll treat him nicely anyway. So it'll be in proper English, not American English. But David is just a fabulous photographer, and it's funny when you read some of these history books, they'll be put together by someone who wasn't there. It's just like they assembled photos, but David was there, in that era, and so the stories he relays were learned all firsthand. So it's a unique opportunity to look at some amazing photography and hear some cool stories, and he brought along a friend who I'll let him introduce. So take it away, David.
So, thank you, Dean. I got to try and live up to that. I'm going to sit down here. I just had my hip replaced, so I'm not doing very well standing up these days. So I'll sit down, and you'll have to see the top of my balding head from way in the back of the room. So I've just finished doing this book. Taken me 4 years to complete, but I started in 1971 shooting pictures for this book. This was 1974, the cover of the book. I'm the author, and Dave Arnold next to me, he's the real engineer. I'm not an engineer or even approaching one. Dave used to be team manager for Honda Motocross here. He was here during the glory days. He's responsible for a lot of the development of the motorcycles you see back there and a lot of the success that Honda had in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. He's now also helping Triumph Motorcycles develop their all-new motocross bike that they're going to be racing next year. David's doing a lot of the chassis development. David's a brainiac with way too much stuff going on inside his brain, and so don't get him started unless you got an hour to run out the stories. But anyway, the book covers basically the period 1970 through 1986, or at the end of 85. It's significant for a couple of reasons. One, I was there, so I could report on it firsthand, but it was a period of just phenomenal expansion of the motocross world, mechanical development like nobody had ever seen up to this point. 1985 was the end of that crazy era when the AMA decided that the factories were spending way too much money. The privateers were just, at a great disadvantage. So they stopped all factory bike development, and all production, all bikes raced in AMA motocross from the end of 85 on had to be based on production bikes. So that's where the book ends at the end of 85 and some arbitrary numbers, but that's where it was. So the book covers a lot of machinery, a lot of the riders' races of the time. But out of interest, who has more than a passing interest in motocross here? Who's, okay, great, I like a lot of hands, that's pretty good. So some of you will know some of this, and for those who don't, I'll just give you a quick summary of where motocross started and what happened. This is a picture from the first motocross race in 1924 in the south of England, Camberley, Surrey. It was a 25-mile circuit on one lap of a 25-mile course. Everybody riding, as you can see, pretty stock-looking street bikes from the time, even having lights on them in this case. Protective gear was mainly a flat cap and a big leather coat. You wouldn't really recognize anything from that time other than maybe the smell of burning oil and the dirt, but that was the very start of motocross. This was in the early 50s. Things hadn't really changed very much. Motocross became very popular, particularly after the war, but bikes really hadn't changed very much. It was production bikes with the lights removed, still with 3 or 4 inches of suspension travel, big, heavy, single 500cc motors. It was dinosaurs racing on dirt, basically, and things really didn't change very much. This was maybe one exception. Rolf Tiblin was a world champion. This was a Husqvarna. It was one of the first seriously factory-built bikes. It was, this Albin motor was actually used over a bunch of different manufacturers, but this was one of the first bikes built specifically to race motocross. And Rolf Tiblin was a world champion on this bike. So to give you some perspective on the era, this was car racing at that same time, and this was aviation at that same time. I think planes had gone a long way further than motocross bikes at that point. Bikes really hadn't changed. This was very, very early 60s. This was Don Rickman. Don and his brother, Derek, built the Rickman Matisse. It was a chassis that was designed to accommodate all kinds of different engines. And this housed everything from Triumph twins like you see here through big singles, later ones even had smaller two-stroke engines in them. But yeah, and this was, yeah, as Dave says, chrome moly frame. This was a serious race bike. It was relatively light. It was still very heavy, but relative to all the street bikes that they were racing at the time, it was this was a serious race bike, and this was very, very popular. Sold a lot of motorcycles. But believe it or not, this was kind of a turning point. The Invacar was built by Greaves in England. Bert Greaves, the owner of the company, was an avid motorcycle racer, off-roader. His brother-in-law was paralyzed, and he built this first Invacar for his brother-in-law, and this became extremely popular after the war. A lot of people came back from the war, obviously with some serious injuries, and this became a big commercial success. But it was powered by a 199cc Villiers two-stroke engine, and had handlebars rather than a steering wheel. It was a three-wheeler. But Bert Greaves was fascinated with motocross, and he thought he could develop an interesting and unique motorcycle. And this is at a time, remember, when big four-strokes were ruling everything at the time. And he developed this, the first Greaves Hawkstone, which was a giant leap for everybody at the time. It had a cast aluminum down tube frame. Again, it was a small, lightweight two-stroke. It had a leading link front fork with rubber intorsion for springing. It had a shock absorber going up through the fork tube there, but it was all rubber intorsion for the springing. It was just a complete revolution. Commercially, it wasn't a great success at the time, and the company was in all kinds of financial trouble. So this didn't go as far as it probably could and should have done. But this guy, Brian Stonebridge, rode this bike in 1957 at a track in England called Hawkstone Park, where he became the first two-stroke rider to beat any of the big four-stroke singles of the era. And this was a giant turning point because people suddenly realized that maybe weight was an important factor in a successful motocross bike. Nobody really thought about it. I mean, literally, they were just still riding street bikes with the lights removed. So this was a giant leap forward. This was not long after that, this was a factory prototype CZ from Czechoslovakia, a twin-port motor. This went on to win, this was the first bike to win a world championship race with a two-stroke rather than a four-stroke. Again, this was a very unique bike for its time. Still not very much suspension travel, but a lot lighter than all the four-strokes. And with Paul Fredericks riding this bike, this became the first wedge in that the World Championship rounds. BSA at the time had this four-stroke, Jeff Smith on the factory BSA. In 1966, he'd won the World Championship on this bike, or a bike similar to this, in 64 and 65. And it was a pretty lightweight bike at the time, and it was fairly successful. But the guys at BSA decided that if they could build a lightweight four-stroke that did well, building an even lighter weight BSA would be the way to go. So they bored this thing out from 441cc to 491, and they made a unique and never since repeated frame for this, all titanium frame, which they thought would be the answer to everything. And some of you will probably realize the result of all that. This thing broke so many times, broke twice during each race, basically. The frame would snap and bend. It was a disaster. It only weighed 200 pounds ready to race, which was pretty amazing at the time. It was super lightweight. You might also notice it has a disc rear brake, which was the first time a disc rear brake had ever been used. in motocross. That was a complete disaster too. They hadn't figured out how to make it progressive enough to be useful on really slippery surfaces. So the bike was an engineering marvel at the time, but it was a complete disaster. And this was literally the death knell of the four strokes. And this was the beginning of just the crushing of four strokes. With Husqvarna had been building some pretty successful two strokes in Sweden, but they'd only been selling a few of them in Europe. They weren't sold in large numbers. And the gentleman on the right is Edison Dye. He was a guy from San Diego he was the first person to convince the people at Husqvarna that there was actually an export market for these motorcycles. Husqvarna had absolutely no interest in selling bikes outside of Europe. And he was the first person to convince them to do that. And he brought this team of top European riders over in 1969 and did a demonstration series called the Interam that went the whole way across the country. And American racers at the time had never seen anything like this. Everybody over here was still riding flat track, big Triumph twins, big four-stroke singles, the odd smooth scrambles track maybe, but nobody had ever seen anything like motocross before. And it became, almost overnight, it became just this huge success. And this also coincided with a movie that some of you have probably seen called On Any Sunday, which also helped propel motocross into a whole new realm in this country and around the world, but particularly here. So this is, again, give you some perspective on what was happening at the same time, race cars at that time, and believe it or not, that's where we were starting with airplanes at that time also. So things moved pretty rapidly all of a sudden. Everybody realized that lightweight was important, but what happened was people suddenly realized that with the market in America, there were thousands of potential customers that they hadn't even thought about before. So all of a sudden, the Japanese manufacturers became interested in this potential huge market. And this was one of the early, well, this was 5 years into Suzuki's reign over here, but this was probably one of the most successful and revolutionary bikes that came out of Japan at the time, the R872 Suzuki. This is the bike that Joel Robert rode to World Championship. It was the lightest bike ever made. It was 168 pounds ready to race. It was just phenomenal. It had magnesium, titanium, it had everything thrown at this thing to make it as light as possible. They were convinced again that lightweight was the secret to motocross success. And this thing was just phenomenally successful. Roger DaCosta, who was later world champion, said that at the time, this motorcycle was probably the most competitive bike he'd ever ridden relative to everything else at his time. In his whole career, nothing was more competitive than this relative to everything else at that same time. It was that far advanced. And the bike that's over here lined up at the back here, this was the bike that won the first American 250 national championship with Gary Jones, the 250 Elsinore, and this was Honda's start at building a very successful motorcycle. The Honda Elsinore became the most popular motorcycle of all time. It sold millions. I don't know how many thousands did they sell. It's just, it was off the scale, ridiculous. This was so light, so competitive, and this was, again, the bike at the back. Dave knows everything about this bike because this was Marty Smith's bike in 1975 that won the national championship. Dave was the mechanic behind this motorcycle. And again, this was a big leap forward, but still, you look at the motorcycle, they've saved a lot of weight. It was lightweight. they'd figured that out. But suspension-wise, this thing hadn't really moved a long way. Shock absorbers moved forward to give it a little bit more suspension travel. Forks were a little longer than they had been. But basically, it was the same concept that you'd seen, 5-10 years earlier, just refined slightly. Lightweight was the biggest thing this had going for it. Until this guy came along. The guy on the left, Lucien Tilkens, was an engineer from Liège in Belgium. His big claim to fame, he'd made some harvesting equipment for harvesting sugar beets, and he'd become fairly wealthy from his design of this machinery, and he became a lecturer in college, an engineering lecturer. But he was a big motocross fan, and he'd helped, the guy in the middle of this picture was Sylvain Gabors. He'd helped Sylvain Gabors develop and build bikes for him before he became a factory CZ rider and later a factory Suzuki rider. So they'd known each other a lot, and Sylvain Gabors Lucien Tilkens was convinced he had the answer to the future of motocross, and it was the monoshock. These are his original pattern drawings. What he decided was that he was going to triangulate the rear suspension and use a single long shock absorber going from the triangulated swing arm all the way up to the steering head of the motorcycle. His theory was that somehow diverting all the forces from the rear suspension directly at the steering head was going to be some huge advantage. He spent many years kind of developing this. This was some of his early drawings. He used a Citroën gas shock as the mono shock. He modified it quite a bit, but this was what he was working with. And this was the first prototype bike he made using a factory CZ bike that he was given to mess with. The CZ factory didn't know anything about this, but Sylvain Gabors gave it to him. And they adapted it, put a big hollow backbone through the original frame so that he could put the shock absorber straight up to the steering head. They rode that bike, and then his son, who was also a pretty good motocross racer, did a lot of testing. And eventually they managed to get a factory Suzuki chassis, again, without the factory knowing anything about it. And they modified this to accept his rear suspension. And Gabors and Roger da Costa went out and tested the bike at a sand track in Belgium, and they were just blown away by how good it was. And they just came running back saying, this thing's absolutely amazing. It just handles so much better than anything we'd ever ridden. What Roger da Costa later admitted was that what they never even thought about at the time was this motorcycle had almost 50% more wheel travel than anything they'd ever ridden before. They never thought about that. They thought it was all to do with the shock absorber and the triangulated swing arm and all this sort of kind of thing. Yeah, so as Dave was saying, they built they were braking chassis with a twin shock design, and this was part of the idea was to make it a more durable bike, strengthen the whole thing up, which it certainly did. So da Costa and Gabors came back to the chief engineer from Suzuki and said, this thing's amazing. But when the engineer heard the reasons for Lucien Tilkens' design, that he thought it was going to divert all the forces into the steering head and somehow that was magical, he said, no, it's rubbish. That's never going to happen. It doesn't make any sense. I don't want anything to do with it. He literally just tossed it out right there and then on the spot. The next day, another Belgian rider who knew about this test going on, a factory Yamaha rider, called his boss in Amsterdam and said, hey, this thing, we've heard about this bike that's been tested, and it's amazing, and you got to take a look at it. Well, luckily for Yamaha, the guy in Amsterdam said, we'll buy it right here and now, and literally on the spot bought the patent from Lucien Tilkens. This is the bike, the first prototype of the bike that was raced in 1973. Sorry, Hakan Andersen rode this bike. He originally rode it at the beginning of the season and didn't like it. And he raced for a while on the original twin shock design. And then later on, Torsten Hallman, the team manager, convinced him that he really should try it some more and see how it worked. Well, he went on to win, I think, almost all the races from that point on for the rest of the season, and won the World Championship for the right out of the box with this, the new monoshock. The whole motocross world was turned upside down. Everybody was like, well, what the hell are we going to do now? So companies like Husqvarna, Mako, they were all still using twin shock designs, and they all started moving shock absorbers forward, trying to get more suspension travel. This is the actual bike that won the World Championship, and you can see the modified Citroën shock absorber going mounted up there. This was the thing that revolutionized the sport. And this is kind of the final iteration of the monoshock before Yamaha changed to a linkage system. This is Bob Hanna's 500. And you can see that obviously the biggest difference here is that this thing has ridiculously long suspension travel, and probably more suspension travel than anybody needed and anybody ever wanted. And Dave will address this here in a minute, but this was the ultimate monoshock before Yamaha moved on to linkage systems like the Honda over here and Kawasaki. Everybody moved on to different linkage systems. But what happened was the market over here just was exploding. Companies like, this is in the DG catalog, companies like DG were selling, they couldn't make things fast enough for modified motorcycles. The market was just going crazy with all these aftermarket suspension things, cylinder heads. They were selling so many cylinder heads, they couldn't make them up. In fact, Ken Boyko, the sales manager at DG, is famously quoted as saying, if we could put a DG sticker on a turd, we could sell 1 million of them. So that was how crazy it was in the late 70s. It was just out of control. This was well, Dave will laugh at this, but this is the bike I modified, and this is a 1974 Osa Phantom back in England, and I modified this thing with air. I took the springs out. We had all air suspension at the time. I moved the shock absorbers forward to get more suspension travel, and I was convinced that if I lowered the center of gravity, it'd make it better, so I made a steel gas tank that went under the seat where the air filter normally is. The suspension was maybe a little bit better. The center of gravity thing, I hadn't thought it through maybe enough, and yeah, center of gravity low was good, but moving it another foot further rearward probably wasn't the best of ideas. So it was a work in progress. I still won a few races on it, but anyway, but it just goes to show everybody was trying to do anything they could at the time, and there were no rules. It was just do whatever you could and see if it worked. This was Suzuki's early attempt at the very first really serious attempt at a production bike. They'd had a lot of experience with road racing, and this twin port 250 was just the highest revving motorcycle you could ever imagine. It was very, very fast, but it didn't handle very well, and the power characteristics were pretty horrible. It wasn't much of a success. Anyway, we'll jump forward to another one of those kind of aha moments. This is a guy called Don Richardson, who he was an amateur racer, lived in the Valley. He'd worked part-time at a Ferrari dealership in the Valley, And then he got a job working with a race team that had a March race car. And he'd seen the March suspension linkage system and thought, well, hell, maybe I could modify that and make that work on my Yamaha motocross bike. So he actually signed up at the college in the Valley as part-time doing some engineering work, and he modified his Yamaha and designed a system that morphed into this, which was later shown to the Husqvarna people. He had lots of problems with his early design with shock absorbers breaking, and he wasn't really an engineer, but he kind of knew what he was trying to do, wanted to do anyway. This bike was loaned to him by Malcolm Smith, and they modified this rear suspension. This was a test at Carlsbad Raceway, and again, the riders loved the bike, but the engineers at Husqvarna didn't want anything to do with the bike. So it was, he was frustrated by all this, but he was determined. He was a very determined guy. He later took this system, well, you can see the linkage here with a single shock. He took this system and designed basically this system, which became known as the full floater with Suzuki. He took the design to Suzuki. They looked at it and they said, yeah, we don't think it's all that great, but we'll take it back to Japan and see what the people back there say. So they took it back to Japan, and a few weeks later they told him, no, we don't think it's going to work. But then all of a sudden, this bike shows up with almost identical design to his design. They said, no, it's nothing to do with yours. We came up with this on our own. So there was a multi-year lawsuit went on with this design, and eventually he won that lawsuit and made a large amount of money from all the Suzukis that were sold. This bike, the RM, all of the RM Suzukis at the time were considered probably some of the best handling motocross bikes around. Very, very, very popular bike. Sold a lot of motorcycles. So again, one guy from the Valley, just happened to be an amateur engineer, basically changed the world of motocross. Again, here we are. This is where we are, race car-wise, aviation-wise, we're here. And motocross-wise, this was the Honda, the 125. No, this was 250 Honda. What year was that? 70?
Well, it's before 80, so it must be like 78 or 79.
79. Again, Honda still with twin shocks, but motorcycles starting to look a lot different, a lot taller, a lot more suspension travel, things being mass centralized more, a lot of weight concentrated in the center of the motorcycle, more concern about that kind of thing. A long way from that, which was, that was a world championship winning bike, believe it or not, in the late 50s. So things have come a long way, but the basic shape hasn't really changed a dramatic amount. This was another sudden leap forward. Valentino Ribbi, Roger DaCosta at the time, who was racing for Suzuki, had damaged I think it was his shoulder, was it his arm? I can't remember.
Yeah, Roger had a shoulder injury where there was a motorcycle hit him in the shoulder and take him off the bike, and the amount of effort it took him to ride with this front end was easier on that injury, so he started to race this in '79 on the Work Suzuki just for that reason.
So Ribbi had this idea, and this is on the left is his original patent drawing. I just articulated this in Photoshop so you can kind of see where things move to and from. This system was the forerunner of the bike that's over here in the back, the Honda that you see here. There were various iterations of this. This is another variation on the theme. Some had changes of rake and trail. Some some didn't.
One quick note on Reby. There was a study in Italy. It was mainly from the automotive industry, and they tried the wheel trajectory at vertical and then different angles, 5 degree, 10, 15, and it was mainly for design of cars and which design or which trajectory or mechanical compliance was the best for suspension comfort and also fuel economy, and they found like a certain degree. But what Reby didn't like about the motorcycle design is that the wheelbase got so short as the suspension went, especially as suspension travel was increasing. So this here design, the trajectory of the wheel it didn't get as short as, let's say, a telescopic fork at full bottom. The wheelbase did not.
So this is a picture of the bike in the back here. This was a later version. This was like 2 or 3 iterations in. When Roger DaCosta moved from Suzuki to Honda, he convinced the people at Honda to buy the patent for this design, and they tried numerous iterations of this bike, and Dave can maybe talk about some of the differences between the different designs.
It had, probably one of the negatives from this design, even though suspension-wise, it was basically using, the rear suspension on motocross bikes by the late 70s had evolved a lot, but front suspension hadn't really evolved very much at all, except for, let's say, just travel. But a front fork had what they call kind of an orifice dampening, where it had it didn't have very much low-speed damping at all, but then it would hydraulic lock at higher speeds. So just the fact that this front suspension used more of a sophisticated valving system with low speed and the air separate from the oil and all that, this thing, you could run this thing into a square edge curb, and it would go right over with no problem. But the negative that it had, that was superior, and lateral rigidity was increased over the twisting of telescopic. But the negative was the moment of inertia. It had so much mass that was not central to the axis of the steering. It had kind of a heavy feel. So it went through about 3 generations it had 2 shocks on the front suspension, similar to the one you just showed, and then it had 1 shock under the number plate. Then finally they put hydraulic cylinders on the fork and took the shock completely off and put it in the backbone. We never had that in America, but they designed and tested that in Japan. And then it had, the final chapter was they put the shock in the down tube, and then they started to develop just a cartridge fork system without, it was more of a sophisticated dampening system for a telescopic conventional fork, and that ended up prevailing. And also this system, I think there was some bean counters on the production side just shaking their head like there is no way for mass production. So,
and the last slide you saw was the only bike that actually won any championship. It won the Japanese national championship. That was the only time that motorcycle won any great motocross series. So here we come into the 80s. That's cars, aviation. And here we go from early 70s to the late 70s. You can see, obviously, a huge difference in suspension travel. As the travel got longer, the fork had to, the fixed part of the fork had to go somewhere under compression, so the slider at the bottom of the fork had to be extended. The front axle had to be moved forward of the fork leg, and the fork tube itself was, the slider was extended, so there was somewhere for the fixed part of the fork to go during compression, compared to the earlier left-hand image of the early Suzuki. This was all working quite well, but the extension below the axle became an issue, because then in corners, that fixed extension would dig into the ground, would lift the front wheel off the ground. It would, stop the bike in some cases, but it became a big issue. And suspension travel and valving were getting relatively sophisticated, but this was still a big issue. So you can see that, I've explained it anyway, but the reason for the extension of the forks is to give the fixed part of the fork somewhere to slide during full compression.
Especially, there was such a benefit from the increase of suspension travel, started in the mid-70s, and it was never ever even a spec with all the major manufacturers. All the bikes had 90 or 95 millimeters of wheel travel, and then Tilkens, by mistake, makes a prototype just to try to make the frame durable, but it's got 150. Well, then everybody starts chasing that by moving shocks and different things with the chassis to increase suspension travel. And the forks get weird because they don't have any overlap and they have stiction and then they're not stable. But we didn't know where to stop. The whole industry, there was such a benefit from increasing travel. It went from 150 to 200 to 250 to 300. And, and then it went to 320, 340, 360. It was huge. It went to 14 inches. But some of the benefit from having extreme levels of suspension travel, then the bike is pitching and cornering speeds come down, and maybe there was the pitch stability was a little bit increased. So we had bikes all the way. It was ridiculous. And even the seat height, it was hard to maneuver these things quickly, and so the cornering speed was reduced. So they settled somewhere around 310, 320, where everything is today.
So this long-haired guy from Northern California, Steve Simons, he was a local racer, pretty successful. He was working for Motocross Fox at the time, a parts company. They were building all kinds of accessories. He was helping them building shocks and whatever. And he came up with basically the idea of upside down forks, which are on the far bike over on that lineup over there. Basically inverted the forks so that the slider was at the top and the fixed, what was previously the fixed steel part, was at the bottom. Obviously larger clamping area for this big slider at the top made it more rigid. But it also meant that there was more air, the area between the triple clamps was now available for the moving part of the fork to go all the way up to the very top of the what was before the slider. So the overhang at the bottom of the forks that had been the problem before could be removed. They didn't have to have that extension to make way for all those moving parts to overlap. So there were multiple benefits: rigidity, getting rid of the overlap, but it also meant a lot of clever engineering to figure out how to make all the damping system work. And Dave can maybe talk about some of the engineering difficulties that had to be overcome in the damping system for this.
Well, there was an assumption, because conventional forks came a long way with the development of the cartridge and having more accurate dampening and valving, but then the upside down fork was created to minimize they called underhang and rut clearance in the corners, but also it was a lighter weight design. It was more rigid, less torsional, less twist. But the whole industry, Steve Simons and everybody that followed him, whether the Japanese component companies, Kayaba, Showa, or Oleans in Europe and WP in Europe, everybody just assumed if you took the same spring rate and dampening cartridge and you took it from a conventional fork and put it in an upside down fork, and you had the same air spring curve, it should roughly be the same. And it was way different, and took all of us a long time to figure things out, like the bottoming system was far inferior, because on the upside down fork it was challenging. On the conventional fork, the bottoming system is submerged in oil. On the upside down fork, it's up in air. So how do you feed oil, and how do you recover a bottoming system that was effective? And also at the same time on a conventional fork, there's a thing called a spring collar. As the inner tube slides through the outer tube, it's going through a bath of oil. There's a spring collar with a bunch of holes in it, and it in itself created a lot of dampening that, you know, everybody sort of discounted, and that none of it really got resolved until Simons developed a bottoming system that was pressurized from the cartridge, which is probably getting too far out there. But then also, ultimately, I think it was Showa, they made a twin chamber, so they flipped the cartridge upside down. They separated the air and the oil with either a bladder or a spring and a diaphragm with some air. And then it had a bottoming system comparable to a conventional fork. So it took a long time the rigidity aspects and the weight aspects were there, but the quality of the dampening wasn't.
So to prove his system, Steve Simons worked with Brad Lackey here on the right, and in 1982, Brad Lackey won the world championship, his one and only world championship on the Suzuki with the Simons upside down fork. And Brad put a lot of success down to the work in the front suspension on that bike. So,
and then he got fired for changing the original suspension components.
So anyway, he got fired, but after that, every manufacturer in the world ended up paying royalties to Steve Simons for their different versions of the same upside-down fork system. And every motocross bike and almost all street bikes today have inverted forks of one design or another. And Steve Simons, again, this one guy with not a huge amount of engineering experience, just, again, turned the sport upside down. Which brings us to the bike in the middle of the lineup over there, the Bob Hanna's 1985 RC 250 Supercross bike. I called it the ultimate motocross bike in the book. This was kind of the pinnacle of motocross engineering. Dave tells me that, because he wrote the checks for all these, being the team manager at the time, each one of these bikes cost equivalent of about $1 million of today's dollars back in 1985. Maybe Dave can walk us through some of the amazing engineering that went into this thing.
There was an environment at the time where Honda in the late 70s was focused a lot on the auto development with some of the fuel embargoes and the development of CVCC, some of the engines, and a lot of the engineering resource went that direction. And Yamaha was aggressive in racing and doing well with Kenny Robertson racing, a lot of the product for the average customer. And then I think Yamaha went to a dealer convention and said, we're going to be #1 next year. And Honda should have fit, so they didn't really like a whole lot about that. So then it was war, they wanted to protect their market share and their status in the market. But there was a production regulation that mainly was pushed by Yamaha to limit Honda's ability to build things that were exotic. And so that came into effect in '86. So this bike in '85 was developed, and it was really a test bed. I mean, there was so much technology, but so much adjustability in this bike that it's even things like, let's say, the linkage pickup points. I mean, when you build a chassis, most of those things are fixed. And every pickup point on this chassis, if you can see it when you look at the bike, is a bolt-on billet piece to where they didn't have those pivot points as limitations. And the exhaust valve, everybody's exhaust valve, and they're a little bit different, but they're controlled by a mechanical system, with balls and springs and ramps. And so this system was controlled by an electronic system, and we had an engineer there with his laptop, and you could control the opening speed and closing speed and the timing, and it's different on acceleration and deceleration. I mean, it was like Formula One, or what we really didn't know about Formula One, but it certainly was new in motocross, but it was a real rocket ship relative to, but it did help pave the way for, even though we went to production regulations in '86, Honda ended up with production base. Even in a year, Yamaha was really looking for Honda to fall on their face. Honda won every championship worldwide, largely due to what they learned on this works bike.
This, ProLink was Honda's version of the linkage wars, different in some ways to other companies, and maybe Dave can just address some of that, but a more compact design than anybody else had produced up until that point, right? Way less space taken up.
The benefits? Yeah, Honda went for a simpler system, a more compact system than some of the other manufacturers. Mass centralized. There was a theme with a lot of the engineering to get the center of gravity as low as they could, but also the mass centralized as possible in the layout of the chassis. And ProLink provided that. And then also the forces went more into the main frame structure, so you could have a subframe structure that just needed to hold the seat and the exhaust pipe and a fender and an airbox on, and it didn't need the strength or mass or weight of, let's say, a frame structure that had to hold a rocker that was 12 inches further back on the bike. So a lot of it was simplicity and weight, and but also the theme of lower center of gravity, given that the bike had a lot of suspension travel and it was pretty high anyway. It was all about mass centralization and low CG and a simple system.
I mean, this thing also had rudimentary air ducting for the seat. One of the unique features was the seat on this bike went all the way up to the steering head, basically. We'll come back to this here and you can see, but this was one of the first bikes to have the seat extend all the way forward like this, allowed the rider to get way further forward on the bike in corners to get more weight over the front end. Again, this bike you also look at all the heavy mass in the directly above the stand under the bike. Everything's so concentrated, there's nothing hanging out there with any weight. Dave also talked about this bike had mass centralized from left to right as well. There was minimal magneto CDI or anything hanging off the end of the crank. If they wanted to increase flywheel mass on this thing, they would literally add it to the flywheel, the crank flywheel itself, with different materials. Again, trying to keep all that mass as close to the center of the bike as they could.
Yeah, it was more on the, we found over time that, previous to that, if you increased or decreased flywheel mass, typically you did it out on the ACG or the magnets and the big rotor that was involved with the electronics, but that was outboard of the center of the bike. But it was benefit to the handling of the bike and maneuverability of the bike that just to change the mass toward the center of the line of the chassis as much as possible. And we had these crankshafts, I think they had a nickname at the time, I forget what button, but we had little inserts, whether it was Teflon or aluminum or steel or tungsten or different, and we could mix all those things up, and you had to split the cases, yet when you rebuilt the motor, you could change the flywheel mass, and it was pretty tricky. There's one thing that Dave, when he was showing you the seat, they did a lot of things with this bike, but also since 82, 83, 84, we were playing with lower in the center of gravity and also even the location of the fuel, because when the fuel weighs a lot and when you have a full tank or an empty tank, it's nice to have that change more toward the center of gravity than up high or out on one of the ends. But in any case, this tank had, on the other side of the bike, some of the tanks had a low gas tank with a fuel pump on. I think David Bailey's 500 is like that. And what that allowed you was the weight of the mass to be centered, the fuel to be centered toward the mass. But then also, there's things that we started to do and the engineers started to do to get air coming through the number plate. Most of these number plates, not this one, but some of the other ones are a screen, and we started to get a benefit of the air going directly to the air box from the front of the bike. Not so much like a sport bike where you're relying on speed, you know, and that's kind of pressurized intake. But on these things here, it's so bad for the performance of the engine to get hot air exhausted from radiators. Typically it just, and the motor, it just stays in the middle of the chassis, and it's hard to isolate it from the air box, and any warm air that went in the air box was a big negative. But we could get the majority of air going to the air box to be cooler air, and that was a big power increase benefit.
Along with the bikes changing a lot, the riding style changed dramatically too, partly because of the way the bikes changed. Early on, those short suspension travel bikes, they were ridden on smoother tracks than you'll see today, and a lot of the riders would sit down a lot more on the bikes, not stand up on the bikes as much. These bikes, and even later than this, the riders began to stand up a lot more, move the weight over the handlebars a lot more, and actually developed all kinds of different riding techniques. One of the ones, David Bailey and Johnny O'Mara, who were factory riders on these bikes in the mid-80s, one day they were out at Hondaland's test track out in the valley, Simi Valley, and Johnny O'Mara was just playing around going up a huge, big, almost vertical cliff, and they were just jumping up this thing and landing on the top. And he went up one time and up this thing and kind of got out of control, and the bike was just going straight up in the air, and he thought he was going to come crashing down. And in the panic, he just stood on the rear brake. It was just instinct. It stood on the rear brake. And David Bailey was watching from below, and as he went up and stood on the brake, the bike just rotated forward. And they go, what the hell was that? So they started messing around, seeing what was going on, and that was the beginning of what now everybody employs. Everybody in motocross, supercross employs. It's called brake tapping. You just use the inertia of the wheel to pivot the bike forward, so you can jump the bike through the air, and if you think you're going to be landing too front wheel high, you just tap the brake and the bike will pivot forward. Conversely, you can open the throttle and make the bike rotate back onto the rear wheel, so you can correct it if you're going to be landing too front wheel first. There are a lot of things changed in the way people rode. Even David Bailey said at one point he changed the foot pegs on his bike and moved the foot pegs back 2 millimeters, he claims, and that allowed him to lean forward on the handlebars more, allowed him to be able to put more pressure on the bars in corners and everything. Just a 2 millimeter movement of the foot pegs back changed the way the bike handled for him, and completely changed how well he could ride on the bike. So there are a lot of small, tiny changes at this point. The bikes had changed massively, but now we got to the point where there were lots of tiny little changes that were really making a huge difference to the way people could perform on the bikes. The seat extension up to the front of the bike, all these things were just massive changes that continue to this day. This was, this was the ultimate from a high-tech standpoint and from an expense standpoint. Beyond this, this thing was the end of it, but we went from, this, believe it or not, and, this was 75. This is a current production bike. But for the last, 20, 30 years, we've gone to four-stroke motors. Four-stroke engines have become the thing. But really, there's not a huge amount of change in the last 20 or 30 years, really, mechanically.
I mean, everything continues to refine, obviously,
Yeah.
but I think the big, of course I'm biased, but anyway, I think the big curve was, I mean, if you look back at, you were showing the English bikes, and it was, you know, a lot of people just riding modified street bikes, but then there was baby boomers, all the kids from people coming out of the war with and you know, they got, and then the introduction of European two-strokes, which was a purpose-built bike for motocross, and they were expensive, but that was a big jump in the sport. Then that was probably in the late 60s, right? Then the Japanese get involved in the early 70s because it's just exploding in the market potential. And the Japanese at first bring the lightweight was the biggest thing, and durability, and even a dealer network to sell a lot of this stuff. But then by the mid-70s, it was a suspension travel revolution that lasted for 5 years. You know, we got water cooling, and we got, you know, some sophistication. After they increased suspension travel, the load on the suspension, you know, and the fade on the dampening went up quite a bit. So we had to have gas reservoirs and twin chamber forks and all that kind of stuff, but it wasn't until the early 80s that progressivity and lower the center of gravity came in, and then that was another revolution until disc brakes and power valves and production regulations. So I would say so much happened for those 15 years, and then it slowed up quite a bit, even though we transitioned to 4-strokes. There's still differences for sure, and there's still new technology, but it's slowed up quite a bit.
So that's about where we end, guys. I don't know if anybody has any questions, but please fire away if you have. Yes, sir.
I guess I'm just curious when Honda's going to follow the KTM folks in bringing in the fuel-injected two-strokes.
What was about the
When is Honda going to follow in like KTM's footsteps and bring in some fuel-injected two-strokes?
Actually, I retired from Honda about 10 years ago, but anyway, from what I know, and I'm sure I don't know the ins and outs, but I think it's slightly trickier for Honda. They got to think about, I don't think they'll be as quick to jump back. I mean, that's a niche, and that's really good product, and there's a market and a lot of guys that love that stuff, but I don't think Honda will, you know, they're thinking about sisters and moms and Civics and Accords and a really diverse, broad product line, and so I don't know. I think they'll be more conservative and think in the bigger picture about environmental, because, you know, even though they can make one small group happy, they're going to piss off 10 more. So I don't think they'll be the guys that are going to do that. They're big enough and diverse enough that, and they're also kind of a leader, even in off-road. They're kind of a leader where the EPA and the off-road, the community, they almost look to them to, like, they got to follow the book, like, probably tighter than anybody else, you know. And some of the smaller companies, they can kind of wing it and get away with it. Honda's not real big on winging it in that way. So that's what little I know. Don't take that like the Bible.
Any other questions?
I was wondering if you were involved in any of the wheel size experimentation, like the 23-inch front wheel, or if you can talk to that at all.
One thing that comes with age is the loss of hearing. I'm sorry.
Were you involved in any of the wheel size experimentation, like the 23-inch front wheel?
Yes. Wheel size experimentation. Yes, there was it's gone up and down, kind of like suspension travel. I mean, suspension travel went way up and then it came back down. But there was quite an evolution of wheel diameter. I mean, obviously it went from 18 to 19, and I think that was for motocross, not necessarily off-road, but there was engineers. I mean, everybody, the thing in racing, or let's say the thing in motocross is, you know, sometimes a purely trained engineer from Tokyo University, you know, you can say, Well, a bigger front wheel theoretically can go over a rut, more effectively than, let's say, a 23. So they got on a 23-inch front wheel instead of 21. Well, it's sometimes theory, that theoretically is true, but you got to balance that out with all the other requirements of a race bike and all the other performance attributes that it needs. And so there was lots of experiments with larger diameter wheels, 23 in the front, back to 21 because some of the negatives. They even went on the rear, they went all the way down to 7. Even after they went to 18, they went back down to 17, but then back to 19. There was a trend for a period of time to go wider because aluminum chassis, although they had some kind of a benefit, and the Japanese, probably all manufacturers, they track like trends of customer usage. So trends of people riding bikes in the 70s, let's say a certain number of riding in the desert or the trails and a certain number of racing. But then even racing, the tracks now got bigger bumps and bigger jumps and G-forces are higher. So they track the rigidity, the lateral rigidity, torsional rigidity, And so so we went to aluminum frames because of this trend of stiffer chassis and it also has to be a platform for professional racing. I'm not sure the average guy needs all that but what happened when we went to stiffer chassis, you do lose some, let's say, grip, sometimes some feel on hard pack. You're not on an outdoor national track perfectly prepared by the promoter. You're up in the hills in Gorman or something like that. So to try to get some of the traction or compliance or feel, there was a trend in R&D and a little bit in racing to go to wider wheel. Well, we'll go wider with the tire just to get more traction back and keep the diameter down. And the negative of that is you're racing everybody else and there's ruts on all the jump faces and now your tires are wider and you're catching the sides of the ruts. And so, yeah, they've played, but it sort of is. And it's a little bit the same in the rear. You want the wider for traction. Starts is such a big deal, but then there's negatives for that. There's weight and there's also the ability. A lot of times when the track gets really ready, the teams will put on a narrower tire. Forget the start, man. I need to get through the ruts on the jump faces. They want the bike to track straight. So they still play with it within racing, but yeah, it's something that's been challenged, I would say, a few times, but maybe the base is what you're going to buy at the showroom.
Well, how about if we thank these guys? This was a great presentation. Thank you. So one thing, do you have some books here for sale? I do. Good. Just getting to that. Excellent. Do you know where they're going to be? Out in the lobby?
Yeah,
okay, after out in the lobby, there's books available. I'm sure Dave will answer any more questions, both of the Daves. We actually have plenty of pizza left, especially if any of our student members want to take some pizza home with them. Please help yourself. And thank you again for Honda for hosting us here. I hope everybody enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you.